Welcome to Half Blind and Curious. I'm Alan Ferguson. You already know that because you clicked on this thing. Today we are going to find out about the European elections. I've had to do some research to smooth over some of the areas myself, but I know that some of you will be voting in it and will want to know who's who, what are we voting for, why are we voting, what's the procedure, how does it work, who are the parties, etc, etc. So let's get down to business, shall we? The European elections are coming up in a couple of weeks. And so who is it we're actually voting for? We're voting for the European Parliament, one of three parts of the legislature. So you have the European Commission, the Council of the European Union, and the European Parliament. The Commission works more like a cabinet, but you have 28 unelected commissioners. They're not elected. So unlike members of, say, the British cabinet, which are just drawn from the House of Commons, this is an entirely independent body, independent of the Parliament, independent of the Council of the European Union. 28 specifically because it's one from each member state. So one country will have the agriculture brief, one country will have the employment brief, and so on. That's how that works. The Commission proposes legislation and it's in charge of implementing the final bill passed, making sure it's all gone through properly and is being adhered to. So that's the Commission's job. The Council of the European Union, just known as the Council usually, is also made up of 28 ministers. These are the 28 ministers relevant to whatever they're discussing at the time. So, say for example there is a bill that has been proposed by the Commission on, well, let's say agriculture again. The agriculture ministers, the rural affairs ministers will be there in the Council of the European Union discussing it and doing a kind of parallel job to the European Parliament. So they have legislative power along with the European Parliament. They can scrutinise, they can amend and so on, and they can do things like that along with the European Parliament. I won't get into specific tiny wee details of competences, that's not terribly important. But suffice it to say, the Parliament and the Council do a relatively similar job. They can receive the legislation, they can look at it, they can say, yes, maybe, but with amendments, or no, come again. So, how many are there in the European Parliament? Because it's that we're actually concerned with. There are 751. If Brexit goes ahead, there will be 705. And I'm specifically here going to discuss the UK in this, but before we get to the countries, how is it that you vote? Well, the European Parliament is elected on a proportional representation system. However, it's up to each country to decide what they're wanting to do. How is it they're going to actually go about voting for it? So there are different systems in all sorts of countries. The UK, confusingly, has two. It has one for mainland Britain, and then it has another for Northern Ireland. So let's get down to business. What are these then? We'll discuss Northern Ireland first of all, because it's done in an STV system, the single transferable vote, and that's a kind of ranked preference system. They have 3 MEPs, and these MEPs either go into groups or don't, depending on who they are at the European level. But I'll go into more detail on that when we get to the UK stuff. So the DUP, for example, Democratic Unionist Party member, is non-aligned. She's not in any of the parties, any of the kind of supranational parties as they're called, or European ones. So she's actually the wife of the Commons leader of the DUP. So they're in 2 different parliaments. That's going to be some household. Interesting discussions around the dinner table. The Ulster Unionist Party are in the European Conservatives and Reformists. We'll get to them. And the other one is taken up by Sinn Féin, who are in the Nordic Green Left. And we'll get to them. As for the UK, It's split up into regions. So Scotland is a particular region, and that's the one I'll end up focusing on. Then you have the northwest of England, the northeast, the West Midlands, the East Midlands, the southeast, and then southwest and Gibraltar. Gibraltar is a British overseas territory attached to the south of Spain, and so they share a land border with a European Union country, much as Northern Ireland does, and they have particular arrangements, and they're kind of in the EU. Well, they are in the EU, but they're not in the single market for goods. So, yeah, it's an interesting arrangement. Anyway, they get to vote as well, and they have done since the mid-1990s. And they're part of the southwest region because there aren't enough Gibraltarians to constitute a region of their own, just over 30,000 people. So, you split the UK up into regions, then you get people to go to the polling booth, and what is it that you're actually voting for? You vote for the party. The party ranks candidates, and the more of a proportion of the vote that party gets, the more candidates as a proportion of the 6 regional candidates that Scotland gets will go through. So at the moment, if I remember correctly, it's SNP 3, Tories, UKIP and Labour on 1. That's quite an achievement, getting 3 in one region just with 6 seats. It'll be interesting to see what happens this time round, of course. So, the parties are the ones who select the candidates. So if you vote for, say, pick a party, the Liberal Democrats, because I haven't mentioned them yet. If they get enough votes as a proportion relative to others, they will get 1 seat and the top ranked person will go through. And if they get even more, then 2, and so on and so on. That's how it works. I hope that's clear. It will be worth, in your region, if you want to, looking at the particular candidates for the lists, but a lot of people, of course, will just be voting on party. So how does this whole supranational group thing work? What was I talking about earlier when I was meaning the groups, and who are they? Well, I'll go through them in turn using the British current government system or Commons system to decide who I'm going to speak about first. So the Conservatives are in charge of the Westminster Parliament, so let's discuss who they're in a group with. They are in the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists. I mentioned them earlier because so is the Ulster Unionist MEP. They are a group which would be primarily free marketeer, low taxes, small government, small regulation in terms of the economy. They would tend to believe in more conservative family values, though European parties can be quite a grand coalition at times. So you might find quite liberal parties. Certainly when the Conservatives joined in 2009, it was under David Cameron, very much a social liberal, but now under Theresa May, very much a social conservative. And they are in that party, the ECR, with groups like Law and Justice from Poland, who would be, I guess, considered more right-wing than centre-right. Among, of course, various other smaller parties and MEPs who have also joined the group. And that's how these things work. You get grand coalitions from across Europe coming together and sitting as a group in the European Parliament, because as a group you have a certain kind of weight, and in order to become a group you have to show some sort of ideological coherence, so you need to submit declarations online. You can go up and look up the declarations of any of the cross-national parties if you like. So that would be them. Next would be Labour. Labour are in the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats for Europe. They would be more left-leaning, centre-left to left, and they would believe in the single market for the most part, although unusually in the party you have Jeremy Corbyn's wing of the Labour Party, who are very much what they call Lexiteers, who believe that the European Union is essentially a capitalist project, and Britain would be better off out of it. We'll get to the real Brexit discussion in a moment and how relevant it actually is to the discussion. I'll give you a clue: highly. So that's relatively unusual in that group. But in the main, Labour MEPs would tend to be pro-Europe, be pro-single market, pro-customs union. They would believe on higher customs tariffs for goods outside the EU in general, because that would help protect jobs inside the EU. And they would believe more strictly in things like subsidising farmers or subsidising various industries and large-scale budget increases, or at least some budget increases for the European Parliament and the European Union, funded by, well, pick and choose your taxation models. That's the thing across Europe. You've got 28 different countries. There's a lot of compromise to be found, and that's just built into the system. So to the extent, in general, that the mainstream parties would bicker and argue, the structure of the Parliament tends to lead to compromise and so on anyway. So we have, like I said, the Conservatives and Labour. The next biggest party will be the Scottish National Party. That's going to be only, of course, for Scottish voters. They're part of a regionalist group, a regionalist bloc of parties that want to either have greater autonomy within their own state or secede entirely from their own state, but usually still want to remain in the EU. So if you have a vision for Scotland here, where you would like us to leave the UK and apply to join the EU, then that would be the party that you would end up voting for. Similarly, if you have that free market vision of the EU and more of a decentralised take on the EU, you vote Conservative. And if you would rather a higher spending, slightly more centralised version of the EU, then you'd vote for the Labour vision of it. Next up, in terms of parties, or especially, shall we say, relevant parties to this election, would be the Liberal Democrats. Now, in these elections, they would be they're one of those parties, unusually enough, who have a very coherent platform. We know what they stand for. They stand for being in the UK, being in the EU. They want greater integration with the EU. And some of them, but not all, would be in favour of a more federalised structure. They're part of a group called the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. They tend to be slightly less coherent economically. Some would be on the left, some would be on the right. Economically, so some would be more free market, some would be quite, free market-ish, but with moderately high taxation and spending levels. That's what they would tend to favour domestically. But in European terms, they would tend to favour something closer to a federal Europe. Perhaps not quite a federal Europe, but a Europe that organises itself in sort of tiers of governance that are more or less equal and distributive of power. So while the European conservatives and reformists that I mentioned earlier would want to decentralise powers away from Brussels towards the nation state, seeing the nation state as being essentially the main unit of decision making, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats in Europe would tend to see the nation as one of the steps between local government and full supranational European cooperation. It's essentially just another step. And to a greater or lesser extent in each country, that would be the case. In some countries, of course, the nation state would loom a bit larger in how they think, and in others, less so. So that's the Liberal Democrats. And they have, unusually enough, a kind of rival this time around. But how will they fare? They're called Change UK. They're an offshoot of Labour. They don't like how Labour handled their Brexit policies and shifts and so on, and they were disgruntled at how they handled claims of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And they left to form, as they see it, a centrist group. Not separatist group, a centrist group. How different are they from the Lib Dems? Not certain yet. they don't, apart from on Brexit, they don't really have a coherent strategy, but both parties, more or less, are calling for a second referendum and wanting to remain in the EU. Which group will they end up belonging to? Who knows? But the three Conservatives joined from Westminster, and a couple of European Parliament members joined. And those European Parliament members sit in the EPP. They're the kind of moderately conservative group, with the ECR being a bit further to the right, but not kind of off the scale to the right. The EPP would be where the Christian Democrats in Germany and so on are. And so, very moderate. The biggest party in the European Parliament for 20 years. They are, they're about as moderate as they come. Kind of similar to the vast majority of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. If they are off the centre, they're off the centre by a few inches. This time to the right as opposed to the left with the Socialists and Democrats. So we don't really know, apart from the Brexit policy, where they're going to stand. But that's kind of the same across the board, isn't it? So you've got the Conservatives in the ECR group. What are they going to do? We're going to have European elections, basically because the withdrawal agreement couldn't be passed through Parliament. What kind of Conservative are you voting for? Like, they're actually the biggest, most interesting group if you're looking for complete incoherence on Brexit. You've got some pro-Europeans and you've got some avowed Eurosceptics and you've got some people in the middle, which is why they've settled on that, what they call Euro-realist group, the ECR. As for Labour, they have less of a divide. Most of the MEPs are pro-European, but you will get a divide within the membership and within Westminster itself, and a couple of MEPs here or there who would be definitely pro-leave, and if they weren't before, some are now, on the basis that the democratic referendum has to be upheld. So that's the Tories, Labour, SNP and Lib Dem. Then we have the Brexit Party. They're the real wild card because they have gained a lot of support. They are national populists. That's Nigel Farage's party. Not sure which group they'll end up in yet, but they believe in leaving the European Union as quick as possible, no matter the terms, preferably no terms. They came out today in favour of a no-deal Brexit, that's called. So just get out and just trade on whatever terms are available. They do not like the EU. They think it's overweening, cumbersome, meddling. They believe it's in the way, that it's a system that doesn't help the UK, and that's where they are. So they want out absolutely as soon as possible. They might be part of the group that Nigel Farage was the former president of. So that would be the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy. They're a populist anti-EU group. They have fairly similar policies across the board in terms of not liking the EU, thinking it's a bad thing, wanting decisions taken closer to the people, and believing the people in general to be basically on their side. That would be the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy. Then you have UKIP. UKIP are now no longer the party they once were under Nigel Farage. They're now led by a man called Gerard Batten, and he has teamed up with Tommy Robinson, formerly of the English Defence League, and YouTube edgelords like Sargon of Akkad, who keeps getting in trouble for making jokes about raping female MPs, and various other quite nasty people. There's no point beating about the bush with UKIP. They have got some quite awful people there. And what will become of them? Who knows? Will they be part of a group if they get elected at all? Who knows? There was a far-right group for a while in the European Union, in the European Parliament, but they weren't coherent enough and they kept falling out and the group disbanded. It's not unheard of for the British public to send a far-right person to the European Parliament. They sent Nick Griffin there only 10 years ago. So it can happen, but we'll see if it happens this time with UKIP. At least on their part, they have the name recognition. People will remember them. And if people haven't been paying attention to politics, they might still think that's Nigel Farage's group. So hopefully I've explained that well enough. You go to a booth, you vote for a party, the party has already picked the candidates, so if your preferred candidate in particular is, say, a couple down the list, you better hope that that particular party has a very good night in your particular region. So the best really you can do is vote for the parties. What will Brexit do for this election? Well, the election will go ahead, that's a certainty, but what will happen after that is not. How much time will MEPs have in the Parliament will entirely depend on whether or not a withdrawal agreement can pass the Commons and so on. There's a lot of interesting things coming up with that. So, let me reiterate again very quickly the whole thing. You go in, you go to the booth, you vote for a party. The party teams up across Europe with, broadly speaking, ideological friends, and they form groups in the Parliament. The Parliament then, while it doesn't have the power to propose a legislation, can scrutinise, can amend, and can throw it out or help to pass the legislation. Usually what happens is, because the European Parliament is so interested in compromise, because you kind of have to when an institution comes from across the continent. In order to get anything passed, huge compromises need to be done. And in practice, it tends to mean that most things pass with a super majority of the European People's Party, that's the very moderate right, the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, the group that Labour are in, and sometimes the ECR as well, and definitely ALDE, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. So, I'm sorry in advance if I've got any of that wrong, if I've managed to completely mess up any of the parts there, but I hope it has been informative. I hope it's been useful. Please get back to me and let me know what you think, because if it has sucked and it has got you nowhere, or if I've been incoherent or confusing, I'll be happy to go over it again.